Somewhere in central China, under a hill that looks like nothing, there's a tomb that has never been opened. Not once. Not in over 2,000 years. We know roughly what's down there. Ancient texts describe it in detail, a scale model of the entire empire. Rivers of liquid mercury standing in for real rivers. A ceiling built to mirror the night sky. Crossbows rigged to fire automatically at anyone who gets too close. For centuries, historians treated that description as legend, a story too strange to be literal. Then a few years ago, scientists tested the soil above the tomb and found mercury levels high enough to confirm part of the legend was true. Nobody has gone in since, not because they can't find it, because they're afraid of what opening it might destroy, and maybe a little afraid of what they might find. The man buried there built something else too, something you've probably stood on, photographed, checked off a bucket list without ever asking the one question that actually matters. Why did he need a wall that stretches for thousands of miles, if what he was really protecting was underground? Somewhere in central China, under a hill that looks like nothing, there's a tomb that has never been opened. To understand the man in that tomb, you have to go back further than the wall, further than the empire itself. Because for most of the story you're about to hear, there was no China. Not the way you think of it now. One country, one language, one flag. There were seven kingdoms spread across the land we now call China. Each one armed, each one ambitious, each one convinced the others were a threat that had to be managed or destroyed. Historians call this the Warring States period, and the name isn't an exaggeration. For over 200 years, these kingdoms fought each other in cycles of alliance and betrayal that never fully stopped. Armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands clashed over territory that would change hands again within a generation. And each kingdom, trying to protect what it had, did something that should sound familiar by now. It built walls, not one wall, many. Fragmented, disconnected, facing in different directions, walls built by rivals, meant to keep each other out, not some shared external enemy. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. The wall you picture in your head, the one stretching across mountains in a single unbroken line, that image doesn't exist yet in this part of the story. What existed instead was suspicion, carved into the landscape one fortification at a time. Neighbors who didn't trust each other, building barriers against each other. If you'd stood on this land 2,300 years ago, you wouldn't have seen a nation defending its border. You would have seen a land defending itself from itself. Into that world was born a boy who would end it. His name, before history gave him a bigger one, was Ying Zheng. He became king of the state of Qin at 13 years old, inheriting a throne in a kingdom already known for its brutal efficiency. A place where laws were rigid, punishments were severe, and the machinery of war never fully stopped running. Some accounts describe his early years under the control of a powerful chancellor, a man who may or may not have been his real father, depending on which ancient source you trust and how much court gossip you're willing to take seriously 23 centuries later. What's not in dispute is what happened once Zheng took full control of that machinery for himself. He turned it outward, and then he didn't stop. Over roughly a decade, the king of Qin did something no one else on that landscape had managed to do in over 200 years of trying. One by one, he conquered the other 6 kingdoms. Not through diplomacy, not through slow absorption the way some empires manage it. Through campaigns so relentless, so total, that entire ruling families simply stopped existing. Historical records written by scholars working for the dynasties that came after him, which matters because the people writing his story had every reason to make him look monstrous by comparison to what followed. Describe a ruler obsessed with control down to the smallest detail. Standardized currency, standardized weights and measures, standardized script so that the 7 kingdoms' different writing systems collapsed into one language any official, anywhere in the new territory, could read and enforce. Think about what that actually requires. Not just winning battles, rebuilding the entire infrastructure of how millions of people communicate, trade, and think of themselves. fast enough that the conquered population doesn't have time to organize around the memory of what came before. That's not the work of a lucky general. That's the work of someone who understood, with a clarity that should unsettle you a little, that real conquest doesn't end on the battlefield. It ends when the people you conquered forget there was ever anything else. In 221 BC, with the last of the six kingdoms crushed, Yingzheng did something no ruler in this land had ever done before. He didn't just call himself king, the title every one of his rivals had used for centuries. He invented a new one, Huangdi, emperor, and he attached to it a title so audacious it tells you almost everything about the mind behind it. Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of Qin, not first among equals, first, period. As if history itself had started over the moment he took the throne, and everything before him was simply the prelude to his arrival. He was 38 years old, and one of the very first things he did with his new, unprecedented power was look at those old, disconnected walls, the fragmented defenses 7 suspicious kingdoms had built against each other for 2 centuries, and order them joined together. Torn down where they faced the wrong direction, extended where they didn't reach far enough, connected into something that had never existed on this scale anywhere on Earth. Not 7 small nations distrusting their neighbors anymore. One empire drawing a single deliberate line between what it considered itself and everything outside it. The order sounds simple when you say it that fast. It wasn't. What it actually demanded, in human bodies, in human suffering, in a death toll historians still argue about because nobody at the time was keeping count with any interest in accuracy, is the part of this story that gets left out of the postcard version almost every single time. We're going to sit with that part next. Because before you can understand why this man ended up buried behind a wall of mercury and bronze, you need to understand exactly what that first wall cost the people who built it. Here's a number to sit with before we go any further. 700,000. That's a conservative estimate. Some ancient sources push it higher, of how many people were conscripted to build the first emperor's wall in the years after 221 BC. Soldiers, pulled from armies that had just finished a decade of conquest and were given no rest before the next assignment. Convicted criminals sent north as a form of punishment that was really just a slower method of execution. And ordinary peasants, farmers, men with no say in the matter at all, taken from their fields and marched to the edge of the known world to stack stone on stone in terrain that, in places, barely allowed a person to stand upright, let alone build. Understand what that terrain actually was. This wasn't farmland. This wasn't gentle countryside. Much of the wall's earliest sections ran through mountain ridges so steep that modern hikers with modern boots and modern equipment still describe parts of it as genuinely dangerous. Through deserts where the temperature could swing from scorching to freezing within a single day. Through terrain with no water source for miles, meaning every drop those workers drank had to be carried in, by hand or by cart, across distances that could take days. Now imagine doing that carrying stone, not light stone. Blocks weighing hundreds of pounds in places, hauled up inclines steep enough that a single misstep meant a fall you weren't getting up from. No modern lifting equipment, no safety measures of any kind, because the entire concept of a worker's safety, as something an empire might owe the people building it, simply didn't exist yet in this part of history. You were a resource, interchangeable. If you died, the wall didn't stop. Someone else was marched up to take your place. And people did die, in numbers that historians still can't pin down precisely, because the first emperor's administration wasn't in the business of documenting individual tragedy. They counted labor. They didn't count losses in any way that survived for us to read today. What we do have are later accounts, folk histories, oral traditions passed down through generations of families who lived in the wall's shadow, describing death from exhaustion, from starvation, when supply lines failed to reach remote work sites in time, from exposure, when workers were caught on exposed ridge lines during storms with no shelter built yet to protect them, and, according to some of those same accounts, from outright brutality, overseers who treated a slowing pace or a moment of collapse as defiance worth punishing rather than exhaustion worth accommodating. There's a legend that's followed the wall for centuries. The story of a woman named Meng Jiangnu, whose husband was conscripted to work on the construction and never came home. In the story, she travels the length of the wall searching for him, and when she finally learns he died during the work, her grief is so total, so overwhelming, that a section of the wall itself collapses in response to her weeping. Historians will tell you correctly that this is folklore, not documented history. There's no engineering record of a wall section crumbling because of anyone's tears. But pay attention to why a story like that survives for over 2,000 years, retold generation after generation, long after anyone who actually knew the historical Meng Jiangnu, if she existed at all, was gone. People don't keep a story alive that long because it's convenient. They keep it alive because it says something true, even if the specific details are invented. And what this one says is simple. The wall remembers what the official records chose to forget. Someone, somewhere, needed a way to grieve a loss the empire never officially acknowledged happened. Here's something else worth sitting with, because it complicates the story in a way the simple version doesn't want you to notice. You'll sometimes hear the wall described as the largest cemetery on Earth, a monument built, quite literally, out of the bodies of the people who died constructing it. It's a haunting image. It's also, as far as actual archaeology can confirm, almost certainly not literally true. No excavation has ever found human remains built into the wall's structure itself, mixed into the packed earth or stacked stone the way the legend implies. What the evidence actually supports is something slightly different, and honestly, not much less brutal. Workers who died during construction, especially in remote sections far from any town, were often buried nearby, in makeshift graves along the route, because transporting bodies home across hundreds of miles of the exact terrain that had just killed them simply wasn't practical for an empire that had already shown repeatedly how little individual lives weighed against the project as a whole. The wall isn't built from bones, but for stretches of thousands of miles, it was built beside them. And that distinction, small as it sounds, tells you something important about how this story gets told and retold over centuries. The most viral version of a tragedy isn't always the most accurate one. Sometimes the true version is quieter, and somehow that makes it worse, not better. Because there's no single dramatic collapse to point to, no single grieving widow's tears bringing down stone. There's just an empire that built something enormous, and along the way, treated the individual humans doing the building as a cost of doing business, recorded in the same ledgers as timber and iron. Qin Shi Huang got his wall. What he didn't seem to notice, or didn't care to notice, was what the wall was quietly costing him in the one currency an emperor eventually needs more than stone or soldiers: loyalty. Power like that doesn't sit quietly inside a person. It changes what you're afraid of. Before he unified the Seven Kingdoms, Qin Shi Huang had one kind of fear: the ordinary fear of any ruler in a violent age, the fear of losing to a rival army on an open field. That fear made sense. It had a shape you could plan against. But once he'd crushed every rival kingdom, once there was no external enemy left standing anywhere on the map he controlled, that fear didn't disappear. It just changed shape. It turned inward, the way it almost always does once a man has eliminated every threat he can see. If nobody can beat you from the outside, the only thing left to be afraid of is what's standing closer to you than that. The historical record, again, written mostly by scholars serving the dynasty that replaced him, so read this with the same caution you'd read anyone's account of their predecessor's worst moments, describes an emperor who became increasingly convinced that assassins were hunting him. And to be fair to his paranoia, he wasn't entirely wrong. At least one serious attempt on his life is well documented: an assassin named Jing Ke, sent by a rival state before the unification was complete, who got close enough to the emperor with a poisoned dagger hidden inside a map scroll that the encounter has become one of the most famous near misses in Chinese history. Qin Shi Huang survived because he managed to draw his own sword in time, in a chase that reportedly went in circles around a support pillar in his own throne room, before his guards finally intervened. You survive something like that, and it doesn't just frighten you, it rewires you. For the rest of his reign, the emperor reportedly never slept in the same place 2 nights in a row. moving between different palaces and chambers on a schedule even his closest attendants weren't always told in advance. He built an elaborate network of covered walkways, specifically so his movements couldn't be observed from outside. Historical accounts claim he had multiple identical carriages built and used decoys, so that anyone watching from a distance planning an ambush couldn't be certain which carriage actually carried the emperor and which carried nobody at all. Think about what that actually is. Not the behavior of a man secure in his power. The behavior of a man who has everything and trusts none of it. Total control over an empire and total inability to sleep in a bed he chose himself the night before. And here's where the story takes a turn that should sound uncomfortably familiar to anyone who's watched what unchecked power tends to do to a person over enough time. Facing down mortality he couldn't outconquer, Qin Shi Huang became consumed, almost desperately, with the idea of living forever. He sent expeditions. Some accounts describe voyages of thousands of young men and women, sailing east across open ocean in search of legendary islands where immortal beings were said to live, hoping to bring back the secret of eternal life. None of those expeditions ever returned with what he wanted. Some, according to legend, never returned at all. Closer to home, he turned to alchemists, men who promised, for the right price and the right patronage, that they could formulate an elixir of immortality through the manipulation of rare minerals and metals. And this is where the story stops being a curiosity and starts being genuinely tragic, because we now know with modern chemistry exactly what those alchemists were working with: mercury. The same substance later found in massive quantities beneath his tomb, standing in for rivers in a miniature replica of his empire. Ancient physicians believed mercury, in small enough doses, could grant longevity. Modern toxicology tells us mercury does the opposite. It accumulates in the body. It attacks the nervous system. Sustained exposure causes exactly the symptoms historical accounts describe in the emperor's final years: irritability, paranoia, tremors, a mind that seemed to be unraveling even as his body clung to power. The most powerful man in the world, quite possibly, poisoned himself slowly while chasing the one thing his empire couldn't conquer for him. And the substance he was ingesting in the hope of cheating death is the same substance his tomb builders would later pour, in massive quantities, into the ground meant to protect him after it finally caught up with him. There's a particular kind of irony in that, the kind history sometimes hands you without asking permission. A man terrified of dying, drinking the very poison that would help kill him, then buried beneath a river of that same poison as if it might still protect him somehow, even after it had already failed him once. But paranoia about assassins and an obsession with immortality weren't his only responses to absolute power. There was a third one, and it's the one that would come to define how nearly every generation since has understood him. Because somewhere in his final years, Qin Shi Huang decided that the greatest threat to his legacy wasn't a hidden blade or a failing body, it was ideas. Specifically, the ideas of scholars who remembered a world before him and who might, through their writing, keep that memory alive long after he was gone. His solution to that problem is the part of his story that even the historians most sympathetic to his accomplishments struggle to defend. In 213 BC, on the advice of his chief minister, Qin Shi Huang ordered something that would echo across Chinese history for the next 2,000 years, invoked again and again by later rulers, later revolutions, later regimes, every time someone in power decided that the past itself had become inconvenient. He ordered the burning of the books. Not every book. Practical texts survived. Medicine, agriculture, divination, anything useful to the running of an empire. What he targeted specifically were historical records from the rival kingdoms he'd conquered, along with philosophical texts, particularly the teachings of scholars who looked back fondly on the old order of independent states, men who used history and philosophy as a quiet, coded way of criticizing the new emperor's methods without saying his name directly. The order was simple and total. Surrender these texts to be burned within 30 days, or face punishment severe enough that most people didn't test the emperor's patience to find out exactly what that meant. Ancient sources written later claim the following year brought something even darker. That when a group of scholars continued criticizing the emperor privately, continued practicing forms of philosophy and alchemy he'd come to distrust, he had over 400 of them buried alive, as a public demonstration of what continued defiance would cost. Modern historians debate the exact number, debate whether buried alive is a literal description or a phrase that gained dramatic weight in the retelling over centuries, the way stories do when they're being used as a warning rather than simply a record. But even the more conservative modern interpretations agree on the core of it. Real people, intellectuals, whose only weapon was the ideas in their heads, were executed for the crime of remembering a version of history the emperor didn't approve of. Sit with what that actually represents, because it's not just a footnote about one cruel decision 2,000 years ago. It's the clearest possible statement of what absolute power, taken to its logical end, actually wants. Not just obedience in the present, control over memory itself. If you can win every battle but people still remember, still tell stories about, still quietly admire the world you destroyed to get here, then in some sense, you haven't actually won. Qin Shi Huang understood that with a clarity that should genuinely unsettle you, because it's the same instinct that's shown up in nearly every authoritarian regime in the 2,000 years since. Control the story of the past, and you control what people believe is possible in the future. Let the old stories survive, and someone eventually will use them to imagine an alternative to you. This is worth pausing on, because it connects to something you've probably felt yourself in a much smaller and much less violent way every time you've been told that some version of history is simply settled, that questioning it marks you as unserious, that the people who lived through it and wrote it down surely knew better than you do now, sitting here centuries later with nothing but curiosity and doubt. Most of the time, that instinct towards settled history is just honest scholarship, built carefully over generations. But every once in a while, throughout history, settled has meant something closer to the people who survived the burning were the only ones left to write it down. The line between those two things isn't always where you'd hope it would be. The wall, the conquest, the burning of the books, the burying of the scholars, the mercury, the paranoia, the endless searching for a cure to his own mortality. All of it was building toward one final, inevitable act. Because a man that convinced of his own singular importance to history doesn't plan a quiet retirement. He plans a monument, not for the living, for whatever comes after them. And so, from nearly the moment he took the throne, some historical accounts suggest construction began the very year he became king of Qin, decades before he ever unified the other 6 kingdoms. Qin Shi Huang began building his own tomb, not as an afterthought at the end of his reign, the way most rulers eventually get around to it. As one of the central projects of his entire life, running in parallel with the conquest of an empire, the construction of a wall, and the slow, mercury-laced unraveling of his own mind. Historical estimates suggest the tomb complex eventually required more than 700,000 laborers of its own, a number that, not coincidentally, echoes almost exactly the figure historians associate with the wall. 2 of the largest, most demanding construction projects in the ancient world, running at the same time, drawing from the same exhausted, conscripted population, built by an emperor who apparently saw no meaningful difference between defending his empire in life and defending himself permanently in whatever came after it. What he built beneath that hill in Xi'an is, even now, only partially understood. And what we do understand should be enough to keep you up at night wondering about the rest. For over 2,000 years, nobody found it. Not because it was hidden well exactly, because it was hidden completely, buried under a hill that, to anyone walking past it for 2 millennia, looked like nothing more than a hill. Grass grew on it. Farmers worked land nearby without any idea what sat underneath their feet. The single largest, most audacious burial project in the ancient world, and it simply disappeared from common knowledge. The way almost everything eventually does if enough centuries pass and nobody's left who remembers to look. Then, in 1974, that changed by accident. A group of farmers digging a well in Shanxi province struck something that wasn't rock, wasn't dirt, wasn't anything they expected to find under a dry field they were trying to bring water to. Fragments of clay, human-shaped fragments. Within days, archaeologists were on site, and within weeks, the scale of what those farmers had accidentally opened started to become clear, in a way that genuinely stunned people who'd spent their careers studying ancient China and thought they understood what this civilization was capable of building. An army. Not a symbolic handful of statues meant to represent soldiers in some abstract way. An actual full-scale army, rendered in terracotta, standing in battle formation exactly as a real force would have been arranged. To date, archaeologists have uncovered more than 8,000 soldiers, along with horses, chariots, weapons, and officers of clearly distinguished rank. And current estimates suggest that number may still be incomplete, with sections of the burial complex remaining unexcavated even now, 50 years later. Here's the detail that should genuinely stop you, the one that separates this from being merely large and makes it something closer to obsessive. No two faces are the same, not close to the same. Each soldier has individualized features, distinct hairstyles, distinct expressions, distinct builds, some with mustaches, some without, some appearing older and more weathered, others younger. For decades, historians debated whether this meant each figure was modeled after a real soldier in the emperor's actual army, an idea almost too staggering to fully accept. An emperor commissioning not a generic monument, but a permanent, individualized record of every single man who served him, immortalized in clay to guard him for eternity. Recent research leans toward a more practical explanation, involving standardized parts assembled into thousands of unique combinations. But even the practical explanation doesn't diminish the ambition behind it. Whether or not every face maps to a real man, the emperor wanted an army that looked, felt, and stood like it was actually alive. Not a symbol of military might, a recreation of it. And this astonishing discovery, as significant as it is, sits outside the tomb itself. It's a guard, positioned roughly a mile from where the emperor actually rests, which means everything you've just heard, the 8,000 soldiers, the individualized faces, 50 years of ongoing excavation, is still in the grand scheme of what Qin Shi Huang actually built, a peripheral detail. The main event hasn't been touched. Ancient texts, specifically the historical records compiled roughly a century after the emperor's death by a court historian named Sima Qian, describe what lies at the actual center of the burial complex in language so specific it reads less like myth and more like a construction memo somebody accidentally preserved for 2,000 years. A scale replica of the emperor's entire empire, built underground. Rivers and seas rendered not in water, but in liquid mercury, engineered to physically flow through mechanical means, mimicking the actual geography of Qin China in miniature. A ceiling inlaid with pearls, arranged to represent the constellations of the night sky exactly as they would have appeared above the real empire. And crossbows, rigged on automatic triggers, positioned to fire without human intervention at anyone who breached the tomb's defenses uninvited. For nearly 2,000 years, this description sat in the historical record, treated the way you'd treat any sufficiently strange claim from antiquity, plausible in spirit, almost certainly exaggerated in detail, the kind of thing ancient historians said about powerful men to make their legends feel appropriately mythic. And then, starting in the 1980s, modern researchers began testing soil samples from the area directly above the presumed tomb location. What they found didn't just support the old description, it was almost unsettling in how precisely it lined up. Mercury concentrations in that specific area were significantly, consistently higher than anywhere else nearby. High enough that researchers have been able to map the apparent outline of underground rivers simply by tracking where mercury readings spike and where they drop off. essentially reconstructing the miniature geography of an empire without ever breaking ground to look at it directly. Sima Qian wasn't exaggerating, or if he wasn't exaggerating by much, which raises the obvious question, the one that should be sitting in your chest right now if you've made it this far. If we know this much, if the mercury is real, if the layout is real, if 2,000 years of what sounded like myth keeps turning out to be measurable, physical, scientifically verifiable fact, why hasn't anyone actually gone in? Why, with all the technology available to a modern archaeological team, does this tomb remain the single largest deliberately unopened site in the history of Chinese archaeology? The answer isn't mystery. It's something more frustrating than that. It's caution, born from a mistake nobody wants to repeat. Before I get into why that tomb is still sealed, I want to say something and then get right back to it. If you've made it this far into this video, through the 7 kingdoms, through the wall, through everything this man built and everything it cost, you're clearly the kind of person who doesn't need a story handed to you in the easy, simplified version. You want the real weight of it. That's rare, and it's exactly who this channel exists for. We put out videos like this every single day, digging into the parts of history that don't fit neatly into a textbook paragraph. And if that's the kind of thing you want more of, subscribing costs you nothing and means you don't have to go looking for it. It just shows up. All right, back to it. Because the reason nobody's opened that tomb is a story almost as strange as what's supposedly inside it. In 1956, decades before anyone had touched Qin Shi Huang's tomb, Chinese archaeologists made a different decision. They opened the tomb of a different Ming Dynasty emperor, roughly 1,700 years after the first emperor's death, believing their techniques and equipment were finally sophisticated enough to handle a major imperial burial responsibly. What happened next became one of the most painful lessons in the history of Chinese archaeology, and it's the reason every decision about Qin Shi Huang's tomb since has been shaped by extreme caution rather than excitement. The tomb contained silk textiles, imperial robes, documents, objects that had survived intact for centuries, specifically because they'd been sealed away from air, from light, from the kind of atmospheric exposure that destroys organic material within minutes once a seal is broken. The moment archaeologists opened that tomb to open air, using the preservation techniques available in 1956, many of those materials began deteriorating almost immediately. Silk that had survived for centuries turned brittle and crumbled within days. Some objects were essentially lost the moment they were found, destroyed by the very act of trying to study them. It wasn't malice. It wasn't incompetence exactly, given what was known at the time. It was simply the limits of the era's technology colliding, permanently and irreversibly, with something that could never be replaced once it was gone. That failure became a kind of founding trauma for modern Chinese archaeology, the cautionary tale every subsequent generation of researchers has been raised on. And it directly shapes the official policy toward Qin Shi Huang's tomb today. Chinese archaeological authorities have stated, repeatedly and publicly, that the tomb will remain sealed until preservation technology exists that can guarantee whatever's inside survives the process of being uncovered. Not until curiosity is satisfied, not until funding allows it, until the tools exist to open a 2,000-year seal without repeating on an unimaginably larger scale the exact mistake made in 1956. Think about the discipline that actually requires. This is quite possibly the single most anticipated, unopened archaeological site on the planet. The pressure to open it, from researchers, from historians, from an entire global audience that would watch breathlessly the moment cameras went in, must be enormous. And the answer, for nearly 70 years now, has consistently been no. Not yet. Maybe not in our lifetimes. That's not the caution of an institution hiding something. That's the caution of an institution that's already learned the hard way exactly what gets lost when patience runs out before the technology catches up. Which means right now, as you're listening to this, an entire scale replica of an ancient empire. Its mercury rivers, its pearl-inlaid sky, whatever remains of the emperor himself after 2,000 years, and quite possibly written records, artifacts, and objects that could rewrite entire chapters of what we think we know about this period of history. sits exactly where it sat since 210 BC, untouched, unread, waiting for a version of humanity patient enough and technologically capable enough to finally look without destroying what it finds. There's something almost poetic in that, if you let yourself sit with it. A man who spent his entire adult life terrified of death, obsessed with control, desperate to make sure nothing and no one could reach him uninvited, got exactly what he wanted in a way he probably never intended. 2,000 years later, he's still sealed away, still protected, still in the most literal sense possible, untouchable. The wall he built to keep the rest of the world out has crumbled in places, been rebuilt in others, been walked by millions of tourists who mostly have no idea whose ambition they're standing on top of. But the tomb, the thing he actually seemed to care about protecting most, remains exactly as sealed today as the day they closed it. So here's where you actually stand after all of it. You started this video thinking about a wall, something you've seen in photographs, maybe stood on yourself, maybe just checked off a mental list of things the world agrees are impressive without ever asking who paid for it and with what. Now you know it wasn't one wall. It was 7 kingdoms worth of suspicion, torn down and rebuilt into one man's singular will. You know what it cost, not in some abstract historical sense, but in 700,000 actual bodies, worked past exhaustion in terrain that still kills careless hikers today, buried in unmarked graves, along a route that millions of tourists now walk without a second thought. You know the man who ordered it built wasn't defending a nation so much as defending himself. From everyone, forever, in every direction he could think to point a weapon. Outward at rival armies, backward at scholars who remembered a different world. Inward at his own mortality, which he tried to poison his way out of and instead poisoned himself trying to escape. And you know that everything he was actually protecting, the thing the wall was ultimately in service of, isn't behind stone at all. It's underground in a hill that still looks like nothing, sealed since 210 BC, verified by mercury readings, but never open, never fully seen, waiting for a patience most empires, most people, most versions of ambition never managed to have. That's the part worth sitting with longest. Not the wall, the waiting. A man who could not tolerate the idea of losing anything, not territory, not memory, not his own life, ended up spending 2,000 years in exactly the kind of stillness he spent his entire reign trying to outrun. No army marching past him, no scholars whispering about the old world he destroyed. No assassins, no mercury elixirs, no decoy carriages moving through the dark trying to outsmart a threat that never stops circling. Just silence and mercury, and a version of eternity that looks nothing like what he was chasing when he was alive to chase it. Maybe that's what the wall actually is, underneath everything else. Not a monument to strength, a monument to fear that never found an endpoint, stretched across thousands of miles because no amount of stone was ever going to be enough to make one man feel safe. If you made it this far, you already know this isn't the kind of channel that's going anywhere. We do this every single day, the version of history that doesn't fit in a caption under a tourist photo. Subscribing keeps you in that loop. And if this one actually stayed with you, send it to 5 people who'd sit through something this long with you. Not everyone will. Some people do. Leave a comment, a real one. Tell me what part of this actually stuck with you. And tell me what you want us to go looking for next, because that's genuinely how we decide. We'll be here tomorrow, still digging.